There are nights when Washington, D.C., feels like the center of the universe, bristling with motion, tension, power. And then there are nights like this one. Quiet. So quiet, in fact, that I could hear the clock on the mantelpiece in the Oval Office ticking through the silence. It was nearing 11 p.m., and most of the West Wing had emptied out hours ago. But not me. Not yet. Some part of me always stayed a little longer than necessary, as though the stillness could help me solve something the chaos never could. That I was reading letters again. You see, when you're president, you get letters by the thousands, each day, every day, without fail. Most are filtered, sorted, and only 10 make it to the top of the pile, the 10 that, for one reason or another, someone on staff thinks I ought to see. They're called the 10 lads, short for 10 letters a day. They're raw. They're honest. And sometimes, they hit you in a place your policy briefings never reach. That night, as I flipped through the manila folder, I found it. A simple envelope with international postage, a Ukrainian return address scrawled in blue ink, no translator's summary attached. Just the original letter. That caught my eye. Someone in the mailroom must have sensed there was something in it worth my time that I opened it. The paper inside was creased twice and handwritten in precise, careful English. No fancy flourishes, just ink on lined paper. It began, "Dear Mr. President," there was no preamble, no flattery. The boy, his name was Andriy, wrote plainly. He was 17, from a small town near Lviv. His parents were schoolteachers. He said he didn't need money, wasn't asking for a visa, wasn't looking to come to America. What he wanted was, a question answered. "Do people like me matter when we live so far from the decisions you make?" he asked. "I know we are small. But if someone hears us, even once, maybe we are not invisible." I read it twice. Then again that it wasn't a political plea. It wasn't a cry for help. It was something else, something more difficult to respond to, a quiet test of humanity. That line stuck in my mind, maybe we are not invisible. I stared at it for what must have been 5 full minutes, unmoving, until I realized I had stopped breathing evenly. Outside the windows, the city lights flickered like stars against the dark, and somewhere, I imagined, that boy was asleep in a country where sirens and soldiers had become normal. He had no idea the President of the United States was sitting alone in a quiet office, holding his words like they were something fragile. That I leaned back in my chair. The weight of the presidency isn't always in the laws you sign or the wars you end. Sometimes, it's in the stories you hear. Stories that force you to see things not as a leader, but as a man. At that moment, I did something I hadn't done in months. I picked up a pen. Not to sign a bill. Not to authorize an order. But to write a letter back. No aids, no revisions. Just me and the letter. I didn't know what I would say yet, but I knew I had to answer him. Then came the knock. That it was late, far too late for anyone to be wandering through the West Wing. I turned, expecting a Secret Service agent or perhaps my chief of staff with one last file. Instead, it was McIntyre, my night operations aide. His appearance usually meant one thing, something unexpected. "Mr. President," he said, a little out of breath. "There's been a last-minute schedule proposal. A suggestion, really. From the Ukraine desk. Something you should see." He handed me a thin folder, clearly marked, "Not urgent." But McIntyre didn't bring me folders unless they mattered. Inside was a proposal from the embassy staff in Kiev, a small, barely publicized cultural exchange summit happening in Warsaw in 2 days. Several young Eastern European leaders would be attending. Including one boy from Lviv. No name was listed, but my heart paused. I glanced back at the letter in my hand. It couldn't be. "Could it, sir? I know it's short notice," McIntyre continued. "But they said if you wanted to send a brief video message, they'd make it work. No pressure. No pressure." The irony of that phrase wasn't lost on me. I was the leader of the free world. My words could tilt economies, stir hope, or crush it. And now a boy had written to ask if he mattered. And the universe, in its odd precision, had placed him on my schedule, if only I chose to notice that. I looked up from the letter, the folder, the quiet night pressing in around me. "Clear the first half of tomorrow morning," I said. McIntyre blinked. "Sir. I'll need the recording room at 8 a.m. And someone to reach that summit team in Warsaw. Tell them we're making time." He nodded, left quickly, and I returned to the desk, the letter still in my hand. Some letters ask for change. Others ask for belief. This one asked me to see, and now, I would be wise. 7:45 the next morning, the East Wing staff were already in motion. Word had spread quickly that I'd made an unscheduled change, something I rarely did. The media team scrambled to reconfigure their morning priorities, speechwriters whispered urgently in the hallway, and several advisors exchanged wary glances, trying to figure out what had prompted the deviation. No one asked directly, of course. When the president makes a change, people move. They don't question. Not right away that I walked into the Roosevelt room carrying the letter in my pocket. My team had prepared a generic, diplomatic script for the video, heavy with phrases like shared values and regional resilience. I skimmed it once, then set it aside. "We're not doing this," I said flatly, and gestured toward the camera setup. "I'll speak directly." A few nervous looks flew across the room, but again, no objections. They counted me in. The red light on the camera blinked on, and I began. "Good morning," I said softly, "or good evening, depending on where you're watching from. I'm President Barack Obama, and I'd like to take a moment not to address a crowd, but a single person." I could feel the camera operators tense, their hands stalling on the dials. This wasn't what they expected. "There's a young man from Lviv, Ukraine. His name is Andriy. And late last night, I read a letter he sent to the White House. He asked a question, one I can't ignore." I paused, letting the silence stretch. The only sound in the room was the quiet hum of the teleprompter. "Now useless," he asked, "do people like me matter when we live so far from the decisions you make?" The room stilled further. Behind the glass, I saw a young staffer, one of our tech interns, freeze entirely. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the letter, which I now held in my hand. Somehow, even he understood this wasn't a scripted gesture. "Andriy," I continued, "you matter. Not because your voice reached me, but because your voice exists. Because the very act of writing, of wondering, of hoping, that makes you part of something larger than borders and governments." Outside the recording booth, others had stopped walking. People were watching through the glass now. My team. My aides. Not because they were told to, but because something about the moment had changed. "You reminded me why I took this job," I said. "To listen when it's inconvenient. To see people who think they're unseen." I ended the message with no flourish. Just truth. Just Andriy. The camera clicked off. For a long time, no one said anything. Then, someone behind the glass whispered, "We'll send it immediately." I nodded. "Make sure it gets to him. Personally." Later that day, as the press tried to make sense of the unscheduled message to a Ukrainian youth delegate, speculation buzzed in every corner of the West Wing. Was it a new diplomatic strategy? A symbolic gesture about Russia? A subtle policy signal? They were all wrong. That IT was simpler than that. That IT was a response. But that evening, that evening brought a twist I didn't expect. Just after 10 p.m., while reading briefings in the residence, my personal phone buzzed. Not the one the public knew, not the staff secure line. The one only a few people had. A message. An image, sent from our consulate team in Warsaw. The photo was blurry, taken from a side angle, but unmistakable. A thin boy in a suit that didn't quite fit, standing in front of a projection screen with my face on it. His hands were clutched in front of him. And though the image was grainy, I could see one thing with perfect clarity. His eyes were filled with tears. The message read, he didn't know the video was coming. We waited until the very end of the session. He just kept whispering, he saw it. He saw it. I sat back, letting the phone rest in my lap. That I thought I had answered his question, but maybe it was the other way around. Maybe, in a moment I hadn't anticipated, that boy from Lviv reminded me of something I'd begun to forget, not the power of being seen, but the responsibility of seeing. Not the speeches written, but the silences chosen, and the strangest part. That single gesture, a letter read under soft White House light, had already begun to ripple. The Secretary of Education requested a transcript of my remarks. A senior ambassador mentioned it during a diplomatic dinner in Berlin, and someone, perhaps inspired or merely observant, started tagging Ukrainian embassies with the words, "Not invisible. Not forgotten." The boy had asked if he mattered. The world had just begun to answer, but the story didn't end there, because 3 days later, I received another letter, from Andrei, and this time, he wasn't asking that, he was offering that. I unfolded the new letter with the kind of reverence you might reserve for a fragile relic. It had arrived through diplomatic channels, rushed, they said. Marked with no official seal, only a single line handwritten across the envelope, "Please give this to him, if he still remembers me." It hadn't even been a week, but I knew who it was from the moment I saw the neat, deliberate strokes. Andrei. The paper inside was different this time. No lined school pages. Just a plain white sheet, creased but clean. The kind someone chooses carefully when they believe their words might actually be heard. "Dear Mr. President," it began again. "When I saw your message, I couldn't breathe for a moment. Not because it was you, or because people around me suddenly looked at me differently. It was because you answered." I read slowly, line by line, as if afraid I might miss something between the words. "Since then," he continued, "something strange has happened. People in my school, teachers, students, they started asking me questions. Not about America. About me. My opinions. My ideas. As if I were more than just another face in the hall." There was no pride in the tone, only disbelief. As if the sudden weight of visibility had startled him. "I don't know how to carry this attention," he wrote. "But I don't want to waste it." Then came the part one hadn't expected. "I've started a club," the letter read, "with 6 other students. We call it the Quiet Room. Not because it's silent, but because it's where quiet people speak. We meet after school, in a basement no one uses. At first, we just talked. Then we started writing letters. Not to you, though they wanted to, but to others. Local officials. Journalists. Principals. Anyone who makes decisions. We sign them together. No names. Just, from the quiet room." I leaned back, stunned that he hadn't simply received a message, he'd built something out of it. "I don't know if our letters will change anything," he wrote near the end. "But we figured out that being seen once is enough to believe it can happen again." The final line read, "I thought you should know what your answer started." I sat in stillness for several minutes after finishing that. In a world of digital echo chambers and endless noise, a single, handwritten letter had moved through international walls, crossed oceans, entered an old government building, and landed in my hands. Then it had flown back, not as an echo, but as a spark. And now, there was a quiet room in a small Ukrainian town lighting candles in a dark corridor. That I couldn't let it end there. That afternoon, I called a private meeting with the Undersecretary of Cultural Exchange. I asked questions I hadn't asked before. About student programs. About youth-led initiatives in Europe. About how often we listened when letters came from outside our bubble. She blinked at me, clearly surprised. "May I ask what's prompted this renewed interest, sir?" I handed her a copy of Andrei's second letter. She read it in silence, then nodded once. "I'll make some calls." By the end of the week, something was moving. That we established a microgrant program called Echo Point, quietly at first. No fanfare. No press release. Just a simple portal tucked inside the State Department website. It offered resources for small, student-led initiatives across Eastern Europe. The only requirement, each application had to begin with a letter. Within days, the first came in, from Poland. Then Romania. Then Latvia, but not long after, a familiar hand returned, Andrei again. That he wasn't asking for funds, that he was offering to read the letters on our behalf. "I know what to listen for," he wrote. "The voices that sound like they're whispering, but are actually shouting as loud as they can. That night, I did something I hadn't done since leaving the campaign trail. I wrote in longhand, alone, under dim desk light. A letter, not from President Barack Obama, not from the Commander-in-Chief, but from a man who remembered what it was like to wonder if his words would ever matter, and I signed it not with a title, but with a promise. The news never broke. Not in the way news usually does. There were no press conferences, no dramatic speeches from a podium flanked by flags. And yet, somehow, the ripples spread. Quietly. Unmistakably. By mid-spring, the quiet room had become more than a basement in a Ukrainian school. Similar spaces started appearing, some called themselves echo rooms, others simply student circles. Different names, but the same heart. In Lithuania, a history teacher converted an unused lab. In Moldova, a student council rewired a storage room with help from a janitor. They weren't political. They weren't loud. But they were building something solid, permission to speak. Even softly. One morning in late April, I received a briefing with an unusual annotation, a handwritten note at the bottom, slipped in by an embassy contact. It read, Echo Point Report, 17 student rooms, 6 countries, 93 letters submitted. Many of them quote Andriy. Underneath was a single phrase, the boy who asked if he mattered now carries the voices of 100 more. I stared at the report for a long time, not because I didn't believe it, but because I suddenly felt how easily we forget the scale of a whisper. Andriy's latest letter arrived in a navy blue envelope. This one wasn't folded or smudged. It came printed. Typed. That alone told me something had changed. He'd rewritten it. Carefully. Intentionally. He began with an update. Dear Mr. President, he wrote, I have a new problem. A good one, I think. Our room is too full. Too many students want to come now. Some just sit in the corners, waiting. We only have 6 chairs. We started taking turns on the floor. But no one complains. I smiled at the image, dozens of teenagers, sitting cross-legged on cold floors, just to be heard. Some movements begin with slogans. Others with the absence of one. The letter continued, they bring stories, Mr. President. One girl said she never spoke in class until she came here. A boy who stutters told his full name for the first time. A young woman showed us a notebook filled with poems she never shared. And when they speak, I see it, the moment they realize someone is listening. That's the moment I live for. But it was the last paragraph that held me. You didn't just answer my letter. You gave me a job I didn't know I wanted. To listen. I think maybe this is what I want to do forever. It stopped me, not because I hadn't heard similar sentiments before, but because this one had no ambition in it. No angle. Just truth. A 17-year-old boy who discovered that listening, truly listening, could be a calling. And that somehow, without stepping foot outside his town, he had become something rare, a voice others trusted. That evening, I called a private advisor from the United Nations Educational Council. I asked if there was a way to establish a satellite fellowship, one that could train students in peer facilitation, international correspondence, and reflective leadership. She asked if I had anyone in mind that I did. The name at the top of the list was Andriy M., Lviv, Ukraine. 3 weeks later, we extended the first invitation, not to New York, not to Washington, but to a training center in Geneva, quiet and deliberate, where voices didn't need to shout to be respected. He accepted, not with fanfare. Not with any demand for credit, but with a message, I'll come. But only if I can take our letters with me. And he did. He arrived in Geneva with a small suitcase, a coat too thin for the Alps, and a bundle of paper tied together with twine. Inside, every letter from the quiet room. The rejected ones, the strange ones, the beautiful ones. He called it the Book of Echoes. Not official. Not edited. Just real. And something unexpected happened. The program adjusted around him. He wasn't the best speaker. He wasn't the most fluent. But he was the one everyone listened to. Because when he read, his voice never wavered. Even when his hands did that in a session on cultural empathy, a girl from France asked what made him believe in strangers that he held up one letter, his first, and said, because one did. That night, I received a message from the director of the program that it read, "Your boy has started something." The students now gather each night, unstructured, just to read each other's letters. We didn't plan this. He did. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I went to my study, pulled out the original folded page from months before, and read that first line again, "Do people like me matter?" And for the first time, I whispered the answer aloud, to no one at all, yes. Months passed, the presidency moved forward, news cycles, foreign summits, speeches, deadlines. But in the quiet hours, when the briefings had been read and the lights outside the White House dimmed, I still thought about Andrei, not because he had changed the world in the way newspapers recognize, but because he had done something rarer. He had changed one corner of it, gently, without demand. And he had reminded me of something I'd nearly forgotten: the most powerful revolutions begin not with grand declarations, but with a moment of courage in the stillness. Andrei returned home quietly. No parades. No interviews. Just a slightly more worn suitcase, a few new ideas, and one very well-traveled bundle of letters. The Book of Echoes now included translations, responses, and even blank pages, waiting for voices not yet found. That he didn't enroll in a prestigious university abroad. He didn't seek the spotlight. Instead, he took a small job at a local cultural center in Lviv, helping students write essays for university applications. The man who had once asked if he mattered now made sure others knew they did. The quiet room never closed. In fact, it multiplied. By winter, we knew of 22 such spaces in 7 countries. No organization ran them. No government funded them. They simply appeared, carried forward by young people who believed that silence deserved a listener. That I never met Andrei in person, that he never asked to, but on my last full day in office, as I was preparing to leave the White House for the final time, I received a package. Wrapped simply, with string and a brown paper cover, it contained a small notebook, hand-bound, with no cover title. Inside were pages written in different hands, different languages. Some pages bore tears. Others, sketches. But near the end, in familiar careful handwriting, I read, "This is what your answer grew. Thank you for seeing one voice. It taught us to listen to hundreds." No signature. No return address, but it didn't need one. That night, I placed the notebook on a shelf beside speeches, photos, and mementos from 8 years in office. It didn't look like much. But I knew, more than most, that not every legacy is written in laws. Some are written in letters, and this one began with a boy who asked if he was invisible, and ended with a world quietly learning how to see.